Oh, thank you, Jason, for that. Nice introduction. Well, I suppose the good news is the shutdown's finished, hasn't it? But it's not going to help poor FDA people. So really just following on from what Mark said, well, I suppose I should not apologise, but send my regards from Jeff Farber, who was meant to give this talk today, but for unforeseen circumstances he couldn't do. So it's important to emphasise these aren't his slides, these are my sort of thoughts of the matter, but he does send his regards to everyone and apologies thereof. So when I look at the threat to the food system, a bit like Mark said, it's a very different age now than we had 20 years ago. And I'm going to put this in the sort of big data area, because with big data, as we saw this morning, it's really revolutionized microbiomics and things like that. And the reality is it's here to stay. And like any good research, it's going to ask more questions than we can solve. And as I'll talk about, really that's what big data has done to food safety, in terms it's giving us more questions and getting us to rethink things. But the ultimate thing is we're going to be better for it at the end of the day. So the way I'm going to frame this as well is just to really describe who controls food safety in the populace. And the reality is the consumer does in the end, which is ironic because the consumer is the one we're trying to protect, and the retailers are the ones that do the bidding of the consumer, sometimes to the detriment of that. But a bit like Mark said, the sort of threats we're facing are very different now. And if we can get them at source, those threats, then we don't need to do the policy we've had for the last 40 years in trying to protect the public by trying to put interventions along the chain. But anyway, I'll go on before going too much. So I always see food safety as a tug of war. On one side, we give interventions, we give technology, we implement food safety systems, the Food Modernisation Act being an example of that. We increase traceability, risk analysis, as we talked about this morning, and epidemiology. And the detection and testing has gone on leaps and bounds by big data and the technologies. Now, the pull on food safety is the consumer behaviour. They want ready to eat. They want globalization in terms of they want strawberries in January. And they also have this sort of new eating out, Uber eating out, where you just get your dinner delivered. And there's a few nightmare stories in Canada I could tell you about that. And we get multi-drug resistance, food fraud, and all these. I can't cover all of these, but we'll see what we can cover and see how it is. But we can make safe food, but we get this pulling back by consumers, which industry want to obviously satisfy. So when we look at the attribution, any sort of statistics is guesswork, and this latest guesswork is that most of the foodborne illness cases can be linked to food service and consumers, with a few obviously at the production and a minor part of the farmers. But the reality is, if the pathogens didn't get to the consumer, then it would be more forgiving, isn't it? And I think that's been a policy for the last 40 years. So as we saw in the microbiome talks, which were very fascinating indeed, basically we are more susceptible to pathogens one way or another, and it'd be interesting to see how pathogens interact with the microbiome. We have this sort of tendency to not want additives, all those things, advances in the 20th century. People want to actually go back to the 19th century, isn't it? And that's got consequences in terms of delivering safe product. There was only a recall yesterday with a milk product called Naturel because it was spoiling quickly. And we won't go into organics, but basically people who like organics, that's good for them, but it's inherently more dangerous than conventional. And food fads is another one which we'll talk about. The Uber drive, the Uber sort of service for dinners and people eating out and restaurants sending stuff out, and the social media and all these things add to it. So just some food fads taken from the last few weeks. No one can help but see about raw water, where you'll get pristine raw water from a spring somewhere in where was it? Down in California, I think it was, untreated. Why bother with chlorine? And it's a food safety risk. And as is this latest one, where knives to chop food up isn't a good thing. What you'll do is you'll chew it and spit it out. And I can see the microbiome people being interested in that. And the raw diet, there's a restaurant in Guelph where I come from, where they specialised in raw meats and things like that. It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it? But these are the things, and you might think, well, only a small proportion of people are going to pay $40 for a barrel of raw water. But as I say, small things can have big consequences. So the food safety culture is another aspect we can't get away from. We can do all we can to protect our food, to make sure it's safe, but it's, at the end of the day, you know, the food service sector, and even in the food processing sector, food safety culture is one of those aspects we have to address. And a lot of the foodborne illness outbreaks we see can be traced to somebody dropping the ball, or quite a few people dropping the ball. And retailers are an interesting sort of part of a puzzle. You know, before in the 1980s, retailers were shopkeepers. They were the middlemen. When foodborne illness outbreaks happened, they just put their hands up saying, we just sell it, they produce it, and they would pass on the buck. It still happens to an organisation which we won't mention. But the thing is, even retailers are becoming mini processors. You just have to go into a sort of supermarket, and they've got sushi bars, they've got everything. And I noticed, even in my local supermarket, sort of food safety violations because they don't consider themselves as small food processors. And this is why, obviously, the guideline for listeria came out, because of the risks involved in retail. So all these are push and pullers, but the thing about retailers with GFSI, Global Food Safety Initiative, they're kind of writing the food safety agenda, which I always a bit suspicious of, but anyway, we'll keep on going. So as I mentioned to you, the reality is the philosophy of the last 40 years has been we avoid pathogens getting to the consumer, and we've been partially successful, but we couldn't say we've been very successful. And really, we've only been managing, if you look at the foodborne illness cases over the last 5-10 years, they haven't changed over much. You know, basically, we've run a plateau, and people say, well, you know, you're bound to get a plateau. But essentially, we're just treading water in a lot of ways, and we could make a better system. So when we think about a foodborne illness outbreak, and there was just one with romaine lettuce just a few weeks ago, or was it a month ago, and they were trying to guess, saying, well, is it to do with romaine lettuce, or is it not to do with romaine lettuce? The Public Health Agency of Canada came out saying, yes, it's romaine lettuce, didn't tell you who or how it was supplied. The CDC said, well, it could be romaine lettuce. But the thing is, that's the best we can do, isn't it? Because when we think of an outbreak, and the spinach outbreak of 2006 is a classic example, they trace it back to a dairy farm. Obviously they blame the feral pigs at the same time and irrigation water. But how did that dairy farm introduce the E. coli 157, and where did the cattle come from? How did it get transmitted through the environment to that? And more importantly, when we look at foodborne illness outbreaks, what happens afterwards? You know, we say it's over, it's not over. That E. coli 157 is about. And when you think about other sort of pathogens, they kind of emerge and don't go away. Because the reality is we think about food safety and animal health separately at the moment. So you can see that in any university, they've got a veterinary college and a food science department or things like that, which are totally separated and never the twain shall meet. But a lot of the pathogens we see end up in our food obviously are zoonotic. They can be transferred and disseminated through the environment via animals, and I won't go on about the long list of avian flus and things like that which we're suffering from. Now, as Mark was mentioning, we have got a global sort of food distribution network, and in a lot of ways, and I don't need to tell you this because I guess you know, these pathogens arise from certain geographical locations. If we look at Salmonella Kentucky, which is very prevalent in the poultry industry, that came from North Africa. We don't need to talk about the viruses that come out of Asia. So really what we're talking about is if we can stop these incubators of pathogens coming through, then all well and good. And it's very difficult to do, I know, but we can't think about food safety as just the classic pathogens anymore, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And it all leads down to the One Health approach, which isn't new, basically was devised in ancient Greece. And I think it goes without saying, isn't it? If you've got healthy animals in a very good environment, you're going to have healthy humans. And people are going on the bandwagon of the One Health, but in reality, that's what we've got to aim for. If you go to a river near Guelph called the Grand River, you can basically isolate any sort of pathogen you care to have, parasites, viruses, along with a traditional one. So it's this One Health approach people are going towards, but it's not easy to do, as we'll talk about. So when we think about a One Health approach, obviously the antibiotic resistance comes to mind, doesn't it? Everybody wants to be antibiotic-free chicken. You ask a consumer, what does antibiotic-free chicken mean? It says, well, it hasn't got antibiotics in, but there again, conventional chicken doesn't have antibiotics in. But that's what consumers want, and so they'll be driving the demand for food service outlets and most of the industry, isn't it, to get rid of antibiotics. But it's got unforeseen consequences, such as animal welfare. There's going to be a 30% increase in mortality. Pathogen prevalence will increase because, for the simple reason, that's what we had antibiotics in there in the first place, along with the sort of low growth rates and productivity. So in a lot of ways, if we're going to take things out and going back to the One Health approach, we have to do something different. So there's been some work which we've performed, I haven't published it yet, have to do it one day, where we combine antibiotics with bacteriophage, and it works much better than just antibiotics or phages alone. So these are sort of approaches you can do. You don't have to throw out everything. You can make what we have more effective. And I won't go on about vaccination programs, which have proved very successful over in Europe. Waste management practices, you produce a lot of manure when you produce a lot of animals, and that manure goes onto land. From the land it goes into rivers, and in the rivers it ends up on lettuce and things like that. So it's this sort of holistic approach that people need. So getting back to the original point, which is big data, the sort of third revolution, industrial revolution, well, next revolution, I guess. And when we talk about big data, there's a lot of talk. There's certain things that are used for big data for the sake of big data. But essentially what it is be able to accumulate a lot of data, to store a lot of data, and use that information. And what it's being driven by is enabling technologies. So we always had the idea about DNA sequencing, as someone mentioned about the Human Genome Project, 7 years, $13 billion later. You could practically do the same thing for $10,000 within a week these days. So it's got a lot of enabling technologies where we can collect data, and these have been used by public health to good effect in terms of DNA sequencing, where the source attribution rate has really launched to 70 to 80%, whereas before next genome sequencing, it was in about 20%. Food cases happened, they were forgotten about and brushed under the carpet. But that's not happening anymore. Our means of detecting and attributing pathogens has increased significantly. And, this has really brought to the fore these unusual outbreaks, which we didn't think about, like a caramel apple. Like, who would have thought a caramel apple would make you sick? Bluebell ice cream is another matter where they had listeria within their plant for 5 years before the next generation sequencing actually identified the strain and could trace back contaminated products or clinical cases over 5 years. So cold cases, as I call them, came to the fore. And I won't go through this list, but what we are finding, and again, the next generation sequencing has helped this, is to identify unusual food vehicles. This sort of association of certain pathogens with certain foods is almost being thrown out the window because our ability to detect these things. Now, the problem is, though, isn't it, is that when we are able to detect these things, when our diagnostics is better than our interventions, which has been for a few years, you're going to get an increased number of recalls. And this is, it's been exponential. I think last year was, basically more than the year before. And so what we're finding is product recalls really ramping up due to listeria, due to just detecting pathogens. And you've got to question, is this sustainable? Not only in terms of the finance, but consumer confidence, isn't it? Businesses wiped out and things like that. So the implications of these improved diagnostics is that we're able to determine foodborne illness outbreaks quicker, but as we saw in the romaine lettuce sort of example, it doesn't mean to say we're going to lessen the effect, because you're going to detect them as it's finishing. And we're getting increased product recalls. We're identifying different food vehicles. So the people who produce flour, for example, now have to test for sugar toxin E. coli. They didn't even think about sugar toxin E. coli before. So all these things are coming to the fore. But one of the big sort of black holes, if you want to call it, is the culture-free diagnostics. These are the PCR reactions, etc., which will give you a positive reaction, but give you a culture negative. And anybody who's done top-6 sugar toxin E. coli will know this well. They were getting positive reactions, but negative by culture. And who's brave enough to send a product out which is negative by culture, but positive by a non-culture-based technique? And the CDC are now including these non-culture-based results in terms of prevalence. So what we're doing is we're coming into another area of food microbiology which will become very significant maybe in a few years, and that's bacterial dormancy. So the classic thing by Robert Koch is that if you culture bacteria and it grows into a culture, it's viable. Now, we all know, don't we, that that's not always the case. You get viable but non-culturable, which essentially is where the cell's slowly dying away. But this persistent state is becoming more significant now. 90% of cells in a biofilm are in a persistent state, and the significance about them is that obviously they're more resistant than a growing cell, but they don't culture under normal conditions, so we're missing them. So what we're finding is that because of our diagnostics, we're actually kidding ourselves into thinking our interventions are more effective than they actually are. And that's becoming, a few papers have been published already, which illustrate that all because you don't culture a bacteria, it doesn't mean to say it's dead, it doesn't mean to say it's not going to revive and grow. And one of the holy grails in this area is literally just what triggers them to revive. If you can get that, you'll be a rich person. So, as I mentioned, as our sort of risk analysis and our surveillance has improved, we get a good idea about the proportion of foodborne pathogens, and norovirus has always led the way for years and years, as Salmonella and Campylobacter have. But when you actually look at the data more closely, it's just a fraction, because most of the sort of pathogens we encounter are what we call unspecified agents. So unspecified agents are essentially those ones that pathogens we find in foods, but they're not typically attributed to those foods. And this is, again, where the next generation sequencing is coming to it as a powerful tool, because we're finding these pathogens. Clostridium difficile is one of the most significant. Where you go to a food system, be it lettuce, be it seafood, you'll find Clostridium difficile, but is it a risk? Do we have to take account of it? And this is only the tip of the iceberg. As we get more knowledge, there won't be this sort of separation between a foodborne pathogen and another pathogen, animal pathogen. So again, it's asking more questions than answering. Now, you might think, okay, we get all these pathogens emerging, but what's the main cause of those pathogens emerging? And I'm afraid to say the food industry have been passed the buck on this one. This was by Jones et al. In 2008, you can read the paper, but they attributed the emerging pathogens, those ones we haven't seen coming up and re-emerging, down to the way the food industry works. Yes, you do get obviously travel and you get wars and bioterrorism to a degree, but mainly it's the changes in the food industry. And when we talk about this, we talk about globalization, which is an obvious one. You know, you're transporting these pathogens from an incubator through the food channels. Obviously, increased animal production, more zoonotics coming through. Animal movement, we just have to look at avian influenza, how that travels round. And there's all interesting things, and the question I asked this morning about the trailers is a classic example of that. Are the things we're putting in our food promoting these emerging pathogens? And I must admit, I'm a bit skeptical, but it's an example where trehalose, which is a sweetener added to food, is responsible for the increase in Clostridium difficile, as I say. But it's not real, but I guess it could potentially happen. And when you get stories about the Black Death, which basically cleared out a third of Europe, they're starting to say, no, it wasn't the poor rats that got the rap here, it was humans who carried it forward. So all these things are complicating things, and these are, as I say, the emerging pathogens. We might have to change our ways in order to control them, because, as I say, once they're in the food supply and disseminated, it gets a bit more difficult. Now, as we mentioned, I'll finish off with what we can do about globalization, because globalization is a key part. We're putting our trust in the providers, suppliers of food ingredients, which we don't know what's happening in the country of origin. And there's been interest, obviously, in increasing traceability. Traceability not only just to backtrack and find out where contaminated product came from, but also finding out what happened at each point of a chain. And when you think about food fraud and that, it becomes relevant. Now, food traceability systems have been promoted for years, but the problem is nobody's got one that speaks the same language. It's a bit like if Microsoft came up and all these other software companies come up, there only can be one in the end, can't they? Well, apart from Apple, but there only can be a very limited number because everyone has to be on the same page, speaking the same language. And Frank Yarnis, who works for Walmart, has been a champion of the blockchain system. So the blockchain system, you might have heard of Bitcoin, you might even own a Bitcoin if you're lucky, but essentially it's just a way of making a decentralized ledger. To put it in blunt terms, it's capturing data in time which cannot be changed very simply. And so when you hear Frank talk about it, he said it's going to be so good for food safety. But in actual fact, it's an admission that we can't control food safety because the whole point about the blockchain is that it's based on lack of trust. If you don't trust someone, you use a blockchain to it. So ultimately, what the system does is it can trace the food right back to the origin. And that's all it really does, though. It basically is just a traceability system where you can get instant data. The consumer can say, oh, yes, my pig was raised in Michigan and things like that. But that's all it can do. And with the sort of blockchain as it is that, yes, it can give you instant results almost in terms of finding out where things came from. It can give you an instant readout where that pig came from, for example, which was involved in an outbreak of salmonella to do with pork, whatever it is. And what Frank and Walmart propose is that it can limit recalls. So if you can identify the very farm that contaminated cost lettuce came from, you can shut them down and the business and the industry will be surviving because it can be pretty detrimental. But the problem with blockchain is that it's just a ledger and it's only as good as the information uploaded onto it. And there's nothing stopping a farmer, an organic farmer, saying, I'm going to say this is conventional produce, I'm putting it into the blockchain and away it goes. No one's going to tell the difference. And the other sort of concern people have is about the commercial sensitivity. If you get into the blockchain, you're basically transparent. So if you're a supplier of Walmart, anyone could go in and look at your, well, not anyone, but all your suppliers could go in and say how much you're selling to Walmart, things like that. So, and the thing is that Walmart can make people talk the same language because they own 20% of the grocery business. But, is that a good thing? Because, again, it's one of those things. But I'm not totally negative against blockchain because it does lead the way to better things. But I think people should understand at least about the limitations of blockchain. So, for example, with the romaine lettuce outbreak we had in Canada, and obviously it was discovered in the US as well, blockchain would have not done anything for this because the information of a supplier was not released by the powers that be. So blockchain wouldn't have worked there, but it would have worked kind of in the sort of meat scandal in Europe where they were passing off horse meat for, we were passing off beef for horse meat. No, horse meat for beef, that's it. One way round. That would have helped because it would have been able to see that entire chain. But when it comes to the salmonella outbreak we're experiencing now in France, where basically they discovered an outbreak last year and they were still sending out, not recalling product, it was still on sale in different countries, blockchain wouldn't have worked there because it's to do with the trust and honesty of the actual people doing it, and there's a reason why it got raided last year. But I've only got a minute left, so I'll zip through these. So blockchain is very good in certain ways, and because what you can do is superimpose the Internet of Things onto it, a bit like what Mark was saying, different devices linked up to the Internet. And there's a program in China with a blockchain where you can actually see your chicken being born, raised, and then go to the processing plant. Now, why you would want to see your poor chicken being raised and put into the poultry plant is not an idea. But what it can do is that if you've got monitors, sensors at each point, be it a wash tank looking at chlorine levels, be it a temperature of a rotisserie chicken in Walmart, you can do that. And that's where blockchain will be coming handy. So in terms of food safety trends, which I haven't gone on to, I think the future gives you sort of advanced in sanitation, which is the #1 cause of most foodborne illness, breakdown of sanitation. The microbiome, as we saw this morning, there will be a time when we can look at the microbiome protecting people rather than putting sort of antibiotics and things like that in. The virulence profiling is where, basically, can we tell one virulent listeria from a less virulent listeria? Controversial in its own right, but can do that. And to finish off, other things we can look forward to is this risk profiling through the food chain so we can identify where the risks are, and the intelligent packaging that can report back when things go wrong. With that, I'll thank you for listening, and we'll leave the questions to the end.